I never imagined I'd find myself standing amidst a heap of ash, gazing at the charred skeleton of what used to be my vacation home. But there I was, rooted to the spot where my sanctuary once stood. The cabin, my retreat from the relentless clamor of city life, had been reduced to smoldering rubble, and I knew precisely who was responsible: the Fairview Shores Homeowners Association. It all began a few months earlier when a letter arrived from Margaret Elwood, the HOA president, demanding an amenity upkeep fee for their community golf course. The catch was my cabin sat on private land, just beyond their jurisdiction, meaning I owed them nothing. I called her right away, voice steady but firm. "Margaret, I don't owe you a dime. My property isn't even in your HOA." Her response oozed condescension. "Oscar, the golf course benefits the entire community. It's only fair all homeowners pitch in." I shot back. "I don't use your golf course and I don't live in your HOA, but she sighed dramatically. "Well, that's unfortunate. It'd be a shame if your property were deemed non-compliant." I hung up, fully aware of her game. Margaret had a reputation for strong-arming homeowners into paying fees they didn't owe, but I wasn't about to bend. Armed with my property deeds, legal boundaries, and rights, I dismissed her threats and carried on. Then the fines started trickling in, first for excessive vegetation, then for failure to maintain community standards. All baseless claims I returned with a scrawled note. "Not in your HOA, stop harassing me." Margaret didn't take rejection lightly. Weeks later, my security cameras caught 2 HOA board members skulking onto my land, snapping photos of my cabin. I confronted them, but they scurried off like startled pests, clearly building a fabricated case against me. I thought I'd seen the worst of their petty tactics until one night when my neighbor Jacob called, voice urgent. "Oscar, your cabin, there's a fire." I raced down the highway, heart hammering, only to arrive as firefighters battled a blaze already too fierce to tame. By the time the flames died, my cabin was gone. The fire marshal's report labeled it suspicious. No lightning, no electrical faults, just a deliberate act, and I had a gut-wrenching hunch who'd orchestrated it. The next morning, I stormed into the Fairview Shores HOA office during their board meeting, finding Margaret at the head of the table, her smug grin intact. "Burning down my property? That's a new low even for you," I snarled. She feigned shock, hand to chest. "Oscar, whatever are you talking about?" "You know damn well," I said. "My cameras caught your people snooping around before the fire." Her smile didn't falter. "That's unfortunate, but if your property was a safety hazard, perhaps nature took care of it." That was the breaking point. I wasn't just going to expose her. I was going to dismantle her entire operation. I marched out and straight to my lawyer's office, fury propelling every step. Oscar sat across from Damian Winter, a man whose sharp, calculated air made HOA tyrants quiver. The office smelled of leather and aged books, a testament to years of legal victories. Damian sifted through my evidence, property deeds, security stills, the bogus fines, his face a mask of focus as he assessed the pile. "They really thought they could pull this off," he said at last, leaning back with steepled fingers. "Margaret Elwood's been running this HOA like her personal fiefdom for years, but arson, that's a reckless escalation." My fists tightened. "I don't just want compensation, I want them buried." Damian tapped a pen against his desk, lips thinning. "We've got enough for a civil suit now, but for criminal charges we need something ironclad. The fire marshal says suspicious, but we need proof tying them directly to the arson." I exhaled hard. "I've got footage of their board members on my land before the fire." "It's a start," Damian nodded, "but I want more: financial records, emails, anything that locks them in. If we get that, they won't just lose a lawsuit, they'll lose everything." Oscar knew exactly where to dig next. Jacob, his neighbor, had been at odds with Fairview Shores for years, ever since he'd refused to let the HOA dictate his roof color. If anyone had dirt on Margaret, it was him. The next morning, I pulled up to Jacob's house, the air thick with resolve. He greeted me at the door, his grim expression softening as he waved me inside. His living room was a chaos of old newspapers and a corkboard bristling with pinned documents, a war room against the HOA. "Figured you show up," Jacob said, pulling a file from a drawer. "Margaret been real pleased with herself lately." He handed me the papers. "She's running a slush fund, funnels HOA fees into community upkeep accounts, then siphons it off for personal use. I've tracked it for years." I flipped through the sheets, pulse quickening. Here was proof of embezzlement, numbers that could bury her. Damien's going to love this, I muttered. Jacob crossed his arms. That's not all. A buddy at the fire department says they found kerosene near your cabin's foundation. My jaw tightened. You think Margaret had it torched? I'd bet my house on it, he scoffed, and I might prove it. He handed me a USB drive, hacked into the HOA's security system a while back, don't ask how. Set up a backdoor to pull footage. Check what happened the night of the fire. I plugged the drive into my laptop, clicking through files until a grainy black and white video froze my breath. Two figures creeping onto my property under cover of night, one clutching a canister, the other striking a match. Son of a... I cursed, adrenaline surging. Jacob grinned, time to take them down. That evening, Damien's office buzzed with energy as I handed over the new evidence. He'd already started drafting the lawsuit, but this shifted the game. Leaning forward, his expression sharpened. This isn't just civil anymore, it's criminal arson. With this footage, the fire marshal's report, and those financial records, we've got enough to spark a full investigation. My mouth twisted into a near smile. Let's make sure she never runs a neighborhood again. Damien didn't hesitate. Copies of the evidence went to the district attorney, the fire marshal, and the state housing authority, while he filed a civil suit demanding damages for my cabin's destruction. Margaret, been using HOA funds illegally, he explained, finalizing the paperwork. That makes their assets, including the golf course, fair game. I raised an eyebrow. You're saying I could own their golf course? He smirked. Play it right, and you'll own more than that. The lawsuit hit Fairview Shores like a detonation. Margaret tried to brush it off, calling it baseless, but when the sheriff's department arrived with a warrant, her facade cracked. I stood on the sidewalk outside the HOA office, arms crossed, watching officers haul out boxes of files. Margaret lingered nearby, her face pale, arrogance replaced by panic. Spotting me, she marched over, hissing, "You think this'll ruin me?" I met her gaze, unflinching. "I don't think I know." Her bravado faltered. She spun and stormed inside. Damien joined me, observing the chaos. Once the financial audit's done, we'll push for full asset forfeiture. I exhaled, the weight of months lifting slightly. Good. Let's ensure they never pull this on anyone else. The fight wasn't over, but Margaret's corrupt reign was unraveling, and I wouldn't stop until every last one of them paid. The courtroom loomed next, a packed gallery of residents whispering as the judge took his seat. Margaret sat at the defendant's table, lips tight, papers trembling in her hands. Her usual swagger was gone, replaced by rigid tension. She knew what was coming. I adjusted my tie, Damien's steady presence beside me a quiet anchor. Weeks of compiling an airtight case were about to pay off. The security footage of trespassing board members, financial records of mismanaged funds, and the arson video matched to HOA cronies by law enforcement. This wasn't just a reckoning, it was a demolition. Margaret's attorney rose, voice measured but strained, attempting to spin the trespassing footage as a routine community safety inspection. But the judge's skeptical frown cut through the flimsy excuse. Damien didn't let it slide. He presented the financial records next, and Margaret's expression darkened as the audit laid bare years of embezzlement. Funds masked as maintenance fees had been funneled into personal accounts, thousands siphoned off under her watch. Damien locked eyes with the judge. Not only did the HOA extort homeowners, they retaliated against my client, burning private property to send a message, funded by stolen money. Margaret's lawyer stood again. These are serious allegations. My client had no knowledge of criminal activity. Damien slid a single sheet across the table. Then explain this. Signed approval from Margaret Elwood authorizing HOA funds for special projects. The same account that paid an arsonist for consulting the day before the fire. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Margaret's knuckles whitened as she gripped the table. The judge leaned forward. Miss Elwood, care to explain this transaction? Her lips parted, but silence hung heavy. No defense could undo the paper trail. Damien let it linger. Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. Deliberate destruction fueled by greed and power abuse. The judge exhaled, flipping through the documents before fixing Margaret with a hard stare. Given the overwhelming proof of financial misconduct, fraud, and criminal activity, I rule in favor of the plaintiff. Restitution will be paid in full. HOA assets will be liquidated to cover damages. The courtroom buzzed with hushed chatter as Margaret's attorney whispered furiously, but she just shook her head, jaw clenched, trapped. Outside, reporters swarmed, microphones jabbing forward as Fairview Shores residents gathered, their faces a mix of relief and fury. The HOA had lorded over them unchecked for years, and now they demanded answers. Jacob clapped me on the back. "You did it! The whole neighborhood been waiting for this." I nodded, watching Margaret shove through the crowd, her face stormy. She'd lost her power, her money, and soon her freedom. The HOA would dissolve, its assets, including the golf course, transferred to cover my damages. Damien approached, papers in hand, the transfer in motion. "Once liquidation's complete, the golf course and remaining assets are yours." I glanced at the sprawling greens, Margaret's prized extortion tool, now mine. Jacob grinned. "What'll you do with it?" I folded my arms. "Thought I'd open it to the public, free access, no ridiculous fees." A cheer erupted from the residents. The HOA had hoarded control for too long, and now the neighborhood belonged to its people again. Margaret's car screeched out of the lot, tires biting asphalt as she fled, but the state attorney was already prepping criminal charges. Damien adjusted his cufflinks. "She won't be running HOAs from a prison cell." I exhaled, months of tension easing. I'd come to fight for my home, but I'd reclaimed justice for everyone. The transformation hit fast. I stood at the golf course's edge days later, the scent of fresh-cut grass on the breeze as residents roamed freely, unshackled from oppressive fees. Without the HOA's iron fist, the neighborhood breathed anew. Margaret faced a legal storm, embezzlement and arson conspiracy charges piled up, her allies scattering like dust. Jacob ambled over, boots crunching gravel, gesturing at the clubhouse, the last bastion of HOA rule. "Some old board members are still clinging to hope they can salvage something," he said, "but they're done." He rubbed his chin. "That building'd make a hell of a community center, something for the people, not an exclusive den for power-hungry vipers." I pictured it, Margaret's throne repurposed for good. "Not a bad idea," I agreed. "No fees, no rules, just a place for everyone." Jacob chuckled. "Bet Margaret'd have a stroke if she knew." I wasn't worried about her anymore. She was scrambling for a plea deal, but with evidence stacked high, her odds were grim. The clubhouse loomed ahead, a symbol of what we'd dismantle next, and I knew this fight was shifting from vengeance to rebuilding something better. An older woman approached as we stood there, her hesitant smile breaking through years of weariness. She introduced herself as Linda, a long-time resident who'd endured the HOA's tyranny. "You don't know what this means to us," she said, glancing around the golf course, now alive with people instead of exclusion. "For years, we were too scared to speak up. They fined us for everything, threatened us if we questioned them. It's like we can breathe again." I nodded, having seen Margaret's intimidation tactics firsthand. It wasn't just about money. It was control, a reign of fear she'd wielded like a club. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," I told her. "They're finished." Her eyes shone with gratitude. "If you ever need anything, just say the word." As she walked off, Jacob pointed to a sheriff's car pulling into the lot. 2 officers stepped out, scanning the area before heading toward the clubhouse. "Looks like the final nails are going in," he remarked. I knew why they were here. The HOA's records had been seized, but law enforcement was still untangling the mess, and more charges loomed for the complicit board members. Inside the clubhouse, the air was thick with tension. A handful of former board members sat stiffly at a long table, faces tight as the officers questioned them. Jacob and I lingered near the doorway, watching an officer approach a man in his 50s, the ex-treasurer, neck-deep in the financial rot. "We've got questions about your role in misallocating funds," the officer said, pulling out a folder. "It'd be in your best interest to cooperate." The man swallowed hard, glancing at his old allies, but no one leapt to his defense. The HOA's collapse had turned them into rats scrambling off a sinking ship. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Funny how fast they turn when it falls apart." Jacob smirked. "They were never in it for the community, just themselves." The officers pressed on, and it was clear more arrests were coming. The lawsuit hadn't just dismantled the HOA, it had ripped open the corruption festering within. Stepping outside, I took one last look at the clubhouse. Soon it'd be the neighborhood's, a symbol of reclamation. Jacob broke the silence. "You ever think about staying?" I paused. The cabin had been my escape, not a permanent stake, but with the HOA gone, this place felt different, less a battleground and more a community rising from ashes. "Maybe," I admitted, "still got a lot to figure out." He clapped my back. "Well, whatever you decide, you did something big. People won't forget it." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the golf course as kids darted across the grass, their laughter a stark contrast to the years of HOA-enforced silence. For so long, Margaret had ruled this land like a petty dictator, gatekeeping it with fees and threats. Now it was open, free, a shared space for everyone. Jacob leaned against a bench, arms folded, a quiet satisfaction in his gaze. He fought the HOA longer than I had, and seeing it crumble was a victory he'd earned too. A man approached, steps tentative. I recognized Greg Turner, a former board member who'd bilayed before the end. He'd been complicit once, enforcing Margaret's rules, but unlike the others, he'd shown remorse when the walls closed in. Clearing his throat, he stopped a few feet away. "I know I'm the last person you want to see, but I had to come." I studied him, nodding, the guilt etched into his hunched shoulders. There'd been a time he'd stood by Margaret, but that was over. Jacob watched, curious but silent. Greg shifted. "I just wanted to say I was wrong. I should have spoken up sooner, but I was too caught up in my own position. When the lawsuit hit, I saw how deep we'd sunk into her schemes. I didn't think it'd go that far, never thought she'd—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I didn't soften. You knew what was happening. Maybe you didn't light the match, but you let it escalate, enforced her fines, stood by while she drained people." Greg rubbed his neck. "I did, and I regret it. But I want to fix things now." Greg pulled a folder from under his arm and handed it over, his voice low but earnest. "This is everything I could dig up. Old financial records, internal emails, stuff that might help the investigation. I don't know how much is still useful, but I figured Damien would want it." I took the folder, flipping through pages that revealed more of Margaret's grime. Beyond the slush fund, she'd been skimming contracts, inflating maintenance costs, and pocketing the excess. Jacob let out a low whistle. "She really went all in, didn't she?" Greg nodded. "She thought she was untouchable. That's why she got so bold." He hesitated, then added, "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want to help fix what's left, whatever it takes." I closed the folder, tucking it under my arm. Greg couldn't erase his role, but he was trying, and that counted for something. "You want to help," I said, meeting his gaze. "Start by making sure the community knows the truth. They need to hear it from someone who was inside." He nodded quickly. "I can do that." Jacob watched him walk off, then turned to me. "Think people will forgive him?" "They don't have to," I replied, "but they deserve the truth. If he's willing to clean up his mess, I won't stop him." Jacob seemed satisfied, glancing toward the clubhouse where volunteers were sketching renovation plans. Margaret's old stronghold morphing into a community hub, free of her shadow. As the sun sank, Damien arrived, briefcase in hand, his composed stride cutting through the evening air. He set it down on a bench. "Just got off with the DA, they're pushing more charges. Margaret wasn't just mismanaging funds, she was laundering money through fake vendors. Some contractors didn't even exist." Jacob laughed low. "She really thought she'd skate on all this." "She did for years," Damien said, "but now she's out of moves. With Greg's documents, they've got enough to pile on fraud counts. She's facing serious time." He gave me a knowing look, then handed over finalized papers. "And for you, the golf course and clubhouse are officially yours, legal transfers done." I took the documents, the weight of it settling in. What Margaret had wielded as a cudgel was now mine to reshape. "No more HOA," I said, glancing at Jacob. "No more restrictions, just a place people can enjoy." He grinned. "Sounds like a plan." The legal fight was behind me, and the neighborhood was healing. Closure felt real, not just for me, but for everyone she'd crushed. Margaret would answer for her crimes, her reign of manipulation and power plays finito. Oscar stood beneath a towering oak bordering the golf course, watching kids chase each other across the grass, their laughter a balm over years of HOA-enforced gloom. The land had been Margaret's personal fiefdom, locked behind exorbitant fees. Now it was the community's, no barriers, just open freedom. Jacob leaned against a bench, arms folded, his usual easygoing vibe laced with quiet triumph. He'd battled the HOA longer than most, and this victory was as much his as mine. Greg lingered nearby, flipping through his folder. He'd been working with residents, helping unravel the HOA's last threads. Skepticism had dogged him at first, but his candor was wearing it down. He approached, relief and exhaustion etched into his face. "Just got county approval. The HOA's assets are dissolved, remaining funds redistributed to the homeowners they fleeced." I scanned the signatures. Margaret's empire was ash, legally and literally. Jacob whistled. "So what now?" "You sticking around or heading back to the city?" I'd been wrestling with that. The cabin was meant as a getaway, not a life, but this fight had tethered me to something bigger. "Don't know yet," I admitted. "This wasn't supposed to be permanent, but after all this, walking away feels hard." Jacob grinned. "If you stay, you're basically a folk hero. Neighborhood wouldn't mind." Before I could answer, Linda approached with a tray of drinks, her smile warm. "We're planning a big event next weekend. A celebration, no speeches, just the neighborhood enjoying itself for once. I took a glass of iced tea, the chill cutting the day's heat. Sounds like a good way to mark the end of an era. She softened, more like the start of something better. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange as laughter and chatter filled the air. The clubhouse, once a fortress of rigid control, now pulsed with life. Families gathered at tables, kids darted freely, and the oppressive weight of HOA rule had lifted like a fog burned off by morning light. Greg lingered near the entrance, watching it unfold with a contemplative air. I caught his eye, and he let out a breath, regretting not stepping away from Margaret sooner. Every day, he admitted, but seeing this helps. Jacob nudged me. Come on, let's head inside. I hear they raided the HOA storage room and found Margaret's official memorabilia. Plaques with her name, the works. I chuckled. Let me guess, gold lettering, oversized, impossible to ignore. Linda, trailing behind, laughed. You have no idea. Someone suggested using them as doorstops. The image of Margaret's ego reduced to a utilitarian wedge felt poetic, her legacy humbled in the most fitting way. We stepped inside, and I glanced back at the golf course, now an expanse of freedom instead of greed. What started as my fight for justice had swelled into something greater. I'd reclaimed my own, sure, but I'd helped unshackle an entire neighborhood, and that was a win worth more than any cabin. Oscar stood on the clubhouse's elevated patio days later, the space teetering on the edge of its final transformation into a public community center. Months of legal wrangling, endless meetings, and a mountain of paperwork had led to this. The last signatures loomed. The old restrictive signs were gone. The banquet hall now hosted potlucks instead of elitist gatherings, and Margaret's suffocating aura had evaporated. Jacob leaned against the railing beside me, arms crossed, watching kids race across the golf course with their dogs. A scene unthinkable under the HOA's reign. Never thought I'd see this place without those members-only plaques everywhere, he mused. I exhaled, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the greens. Feels different, doesn't it? Like the neighborhood finally exhaled after holding its breath for years. He nodded. Now that Margaret's out, people are talking again. No fear of fines, no bored nitpicking every blade of grass. I spotted Greg near the entrance, flipping through a thick folder. He'd been pivotal in helping residents dismantle the HOA's last vestiges, earning grudging respect despite his past. He approached, relief etching his tired features. Just got final county approval. HOA assets are officially dissolved, funds redistributed to the homeowners they extorted. I scanned the signatures. The last of Margaret's dominion wiped clean. Jacob gave a low whistle. So what happens now? You sticking around or back to the city? I'd been chewing on that. The cabin was my retreat, not my anchor, but this fight had rooted me here in ways I hadn't planned. Don't know yet, I said. This wasn't meant to be permanent, but after everything, leaving feels tough. He grinned. Well, if you stay, you're a folk hero. Neighborhood wouldn't mind keeping you. Linda approached with a tray of drinks, her smile bright, handing me an iced tea. We're planning a big event next weekend. No speeches, no formalities, just the neighborhood enjoying itself for the first time in years. I sipped, the cold slicing through the day's warmth. Good way to mark the end of an era. Her expression softened, more like the beginning of something better. The air buzzed with possibility. Families filled the space, kids played without boundaries, and the clubhouse stood as a testament to what we'd reclaimed. Greg lingered, watching it all, and I could see the weight of his past easing bit by bit. Jacob nudged me again. They found some of Margaret's old plaques, gold lettering and all. Doorstops, huh? I smirked, picturing her name propping open a door for the community she'd oppressed. This wasn't just about my cabin anymore. It was about giving back a neighborhood its soul. And as the sun sank, I felt the first stirrings of peace in a long, long time. Oscar stood beneath the sprawling oak that edged the golf course, the breeze carrying the scent of fresh grass as kids darted across the open land, their shouts mingling with the rustle of leaves. This place, once Margaret's tightly guarded kingdom, barricaded by fees and threats, now belonged to everyone, a shared expanse where freedom replaced control. Jacob lounged against a nearby bench, arms folded, his eyes tracing the scene with a quiet pride. He'd fought the HOA's grip longer than most, and this triumph was his too. Greg approached, steps tentative, clutching a folder that bore the scars of his old allegiance. He'd been one of Margaret's enforcers once, but now he was helping untangle her mess, earning a sliver of redemption with each truth he laid bare. "County just signed off," he said, handing me the papers. "HOA? Dissolved. Funds are heading back to the homeowners they squeezed dry." I skimmed the signatures, the final nail in Margaret's coffin, and felt the weight of it settle. This wasn't just my victory, it was theirs too. Jacob whistled low. "So you sticking around, or is the city calling you back?" I'd been wrestling with that. The cabin was my escape, not my roots, but this battle had woven me into the fabric here. "Not sure," I admitted. This wasn't supposed to be home, but walking away now feels like leaving something unfinished. He grinned. "Folk hero status suits you. People'd be glad to keep you." Linda swung by with drinks, her smile warm as she handed me an iced tea. "Next weekend's the big event, no fuss, just the neighborhood cutting loose for once." I took a sip, the chill cutting through the day's heat. Perfect way to close this chapter. She softened, or start a new one. The clubhouse hummed behind us, shedding its old skin. Gone were the elitist trappings, replaced by potlucks and open doors. Greg lingered, watching the transformation, and I caught his eye. "Still kicking yourself for not bailing on Margaret sooner." "Every damn day," he said, "but this makes it lighter." Jacob nudged me. "They found her old plaques in storage, gold lettering, the whole deal, doorstops, they're saying." I smirked, imagining her name reduced to a humble prop fitting for a tyrant brought low. The sun dipped, casting long shadows, and the air thrummed with life, families, kids, dogs, all free of the HOA's chokehold. This fight had started with my cabin, but it ended with something bigger. A neighborhood reborn, and that was worth every ounce of grit I'd poured in. Damien strolled up as dusk settled, briefcase in tow, his calm demeanor unshaken. "DA's office just called," he said, setting it down. "More charges for Margaret, money laundering through phantom vendors. Half her contractors were ghosts." Jacob chuckled. "She really thought she'd ride this out." "She did for years," Damien replied. "But the pile's too high now. Greg's files just added more fraud counts. She's looking at a long stretch." He handed me a stack of papers. "And you, the golf course and clubhouse are yours, transfers complete." I took them, the reality sinking in. Margaret's tools of oppression now rested in my hands, ready to be remade. "No more HOA," I said, glancing at Jacob. "No more gatekeeping, just a place for people." He nodded. "Damn good plan." The legal war was done, the neighborhood was healing, and closure wrapped around me like a long-lost friend. Margaret would rot in a cell, her schemes unraveling with every charge, and here the community thrived, free, finally, from her shadow. I turned to the golf course, watching families gather, and felt the fight's true reward, not just justice, but a place returned to its people. That was more than enough. Oscar stood on the clubhouse patio, the late afternoon sun gilding the edges of a space poised to become a community center, only a few signatures away from its new life. Months of legal trench warfare, endless debates, and a paper trail longer than the highway had brought us here, and the transformation was stark. The old members' only signs were history. The banquet hall now echoed with potluck chatter, and Margaret's suffocating presence had been scrubbed clean. Jacob leaned against the railing, arms crossed, watching kids chase dogs across the golf course, a sight that would have sent the HOA into a fine frenzied tizzy. "Never thought I'd see this place without those pompous plaques," he said, a grin tugging at his lips. I exhaled, the greens stretching out before us like a promise kept. "It's like the whole neighborhood finally let go of a breath it had been holding." He nodded. "With Margaret gone, people are connecting again, no more living under a microscope." Greg hovered near the entrance, folder in hand. He'd been instrumental in dismantling the HOA's last threads, his past sins slowly overshadowed by his efforts. He approached, exhaustion lining his face but relief in his voice. "County's final approval came through. HOA's assets are gone, funds back to the extorted." I scanned the papers, the last of Margaret's empire erased, and it felt final. Jacob gave a low whistle. "So what's next? Staying or city-bound?" I'd been turning that over. The cabin was my bolt hole, not my foundation, but this fight had planted me deeper than I'd planned. "Haven't decided," I said. "This wasn't meant to stick, but leaving now feels like abandoning something." He smirked. "You're a legend here. People'd vote you in as mayor if they could." Linda approached, tray in hand, offering iced tea with a smile. "Next weekend's the event, no pomp, just the neighborhood kicking back." I sipped, the cold slicing through the warmth. "Great way to cap this mess." She softened. "More like kick off something good." The clubhouse buzzed, families filled the space, kids roamed free, and the air was light, unburdened by HOA chains. Greg lingered, watching it all, and I asked, "Still beating yourself up over Margaret?" "Daily," he admitted, "but this eases it." Jacob nudged me. "They found her plaques, gold lettering over the top, doorstops, they reckon." I laughed. Her name propping open doors for the community she'd squeezed dry was justice in itself. As night crept in, the golf course glowed under the fatting light, a testament to what we'd reclaimed, not just land, but a neighborhood's soul. Damien's words echoed. Margaret faced a legal abyss, her laundering schemes and fraud piling up, her reign crumbling behind bars. The clubhouse would stand as a hub for everyone, not a throne for tyrants, and the greens would welcome all, no fees attached. This started with my cabin's ashes, but it ended with something greater, a community unshackled, breathing free. Jacob clapped my back. "You did big here, people won't forget." I watched families gather, the weight of the fight lifting, replaced by peace I hadn't felt in years. Margaret's legacy was dust. Mine was this, a place returned to its people, worth more than any vacation home. The sun dipped below the horizon, and for the first time, Fairview Shores belonged to those who called it home.